October 3rd, 2023. 9:22 p.m. Mansfield Road, Shreveport, Louisiana. A 78-year-old man stands beside his car at a Phillips 66 gas station, holding his military Idaho in one hand and his dignity in the other, while two officers decide neither one matters. What happened in the next 47 minutes would take 14 months to surface, cost the police department $19 million, trigger federal oversight, and be watched by 61 million people on every continent on Earth. It all started with an anonymous tip, a Mercedes, and a laugh that got caught on tape. But before we get to the verdict, before we get to the federal courtroom and the jury and the $19 million and the consent decree and the press conference where a 79-year-old man in a veteran's cap said four words that made a room full of cameras go completely still, we need to understand who James Adame is. Not just what happened to him on one October night at a gas station off Mansfield Road. Who he is, what he is made of, what it took to build a life like his across 78 years in a country that was not always, was not often, arranged in his favor. Because this story only lands with its full weight when you understand the man at the center of it. When you understand what it cost him, in sacrifice, in restraint, in the long and grinding labor of surviving with your dignity intact, to stand in a fluorescent-lit parking lot at 78 years old and refuse to give two young officers a single thing they could use against him. Some debts take decades to come due, and some men are patient enough to collect every cent. If you've ever watched someone be treated like a suspect for simply existing, for standing in the wrong place, for driving the wrong car, for wearing the wrong face in the wrong neighborhood at the wrong time of night, drop your city in the comments below. This one is for every person who has ever been told, without a word spoken aloud, that they do not belong. And it is especially for the ones who showed up anyway, every single day, and built something magnificent in spite of it. James Adame was born in 1945 in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, which is to say he was born into a world that had already decided what he was worth before he drew his first breath, before his mother had even named him, before he had done a single thing to recommend or condemn himself to anyone. The Louisiana of 1945 was not subtle about these arrangements. They were written into the law, printed on the signs above the water fountains, locked into the school doors and the courthouse steps, and the polling places that his father had never once been permitted to enter. The system was comprehensive, and it was old, and it had the confidence of something that had never seriously been challenged, that had always assumed it would outlast any individual who dared to push against it. James Adame would spend his entire life proving that assumption wrong. Not loudly, not through spectacle, but through the slow, inexorable accumulation of a life that the system had not planned for and could not account for. His father, Earl Adame, worked double shifts at a paper mill on the edge of town, a place that smelled of sulfur and steam and the particular chemical exhaustion of industrial labor, a place that chewed through its workers with an impersonal efficiency that had no interest in the men it was consuming. Earl came home each night with his hands roughened to something closer to bark than skin, smelling of the mill even after he'd scrubbed himself at the kitchen sink, moving through the house with the careful economy of a man who has used most of himself up already and is conserving what's left for the next morning. He never complained in front of his children. Not once in all the years James watched him. Not about the hours, not about the pay, not about the foreman who called him by his first name, while Earl was required to call him sir. Earl Adame understood that complaint without power was just noise, and he did not intend to make noise. He intended to raise children. That was his project. That was the thing he poured the remainder of himself into each night after the mill had taken its portion. His mother, Ruth, was a different kind of force entirely, quieter on the surface and considerably more dangerous underneath. She worked as a domestic for 3 families in the white neighborhoods north of downtown, cleaning houses that were larger than anything her family would ever be permitted to own, cooking meals she would never be invited to sit down and eat. She did this without bitterness. Or if she felt bitterness, she transformed it into something else entirely before it could show on her face or enter her voice. Because she had decided early and absolutely, that her children would not inherit her anger. They would inherit her standards. Every Sunday morning, without exception, She took James's church shirt from the closet and spread it on the ironing board and pressed it with an attention that bordered on the sacred. Every crease smooth flat, every collar stiffened just so. She sent him out into the world in the only armor she had available to give him. And the message in every stroke of that iron was the same. You will go out into this world looking like you belong. You will go out looking like someone who deserves to be here. And one day, when the world finally catches up to what you actually are, it will not be able to say it wasn't warned. James Adame carried that lesson in his body for 78 years. You could see it if you knew what you were looking at in the straightness of his posture at the gas station pump on the night of October 3rd, in the unhurried steadiness of his hands, in the way he stood, not rigid, not aggressive, but completely, unassailably upright, even as the patrol car lights came on and the old familiar calculus began its rotation in his chest. He grew up watching the civil rights movement unfold on a second-hand black and white television set in the front room of the house his father rented. Never owned, because ownership required capital and capital required access to credit and credit required a system willing to extend it to you. And that system, in Baton Rouge in the 1950s, was not so willing. He watched men and women who looked like his parents, who looked like him, who had his same hands and his same Sunday morning church clothes, get hosed down in the streets of Birmingham and beaten on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma for the crime of wanting to vote, of wanting to eat at a lunch counter, of wanting to exist in public space with the same unquestioned ease that the white children in his textbooks seemed to inhabit as a birthright. He absorbed all of it. He was a teenager during the height of it, which meant he was precisely the right age to let it become part of the foundational structure of who he was, not a chapter he read about in school, but a reality he watched happen to people he recognized in real time, with no distance between himself and the images on that secondhand screen. He was 19 years old when he walked into a recruitment office on a Thursday afternoon and enlisted in the United States Army. He has been asked about this decision many times over the years, by journalists, by his grandchildren, by the attorney who represented him in federal court. And his answer has never changed, has never dressed itself up in patriotism or sentiment, because James Adame has always preferred accuracy to theater. He did not enlist because the country had earned his loyalty. He did not enlist because the institutions of America had shown him, or his father, or his grandfather, or any of the men who looked like him, anything that could reasonably be called justice, or reciprocity, or even basic good faith. He enlisted because service was something that ran through his bloodline the way certain rivers run underground, invisible on the surface, constant and unmistakable beneath it. His grandfather had served in the First World War in a segregated unit that fought with distinction and came home to a welcome that was an insult to the word. His grandfather's father before that, in circumstances older and darker still. A thread of sacrifice running through the generations that no amount of injustice had managed to cut, and that James, at 19, had no intention of being the one to sever. There is something in some families that is larger than the grievance, that insists on showing up even when showing up is unrewarded, even when the institution you're showing up for would not do the same for you. James Adame had that thing. He may have been born with it. He certainly never lost it. 2 tours followed. He has never spoken about them in specific detail to anyone outside of the men who were there alongside him. And even with those men, decades later, the language is spare and oblique, the shorthand of people who share an experience that language was not quite built to carry. What is known, what entered the public record during the trial, is that he served with distinction, that he was cited for bravery under fire, and that he came home with a Bronze Star and a pair of knees that would be surgically rebuilt twice in the decades that followed, the jungle having done its particular and lasting work on a young man's joints. He came home in 1967 to a country that was still, loudly and in many public forums, mid-argument about whether he deserved to sit at the same lunch counter as the men he had spent 2 years fighting alongside in the heat and the mud and the silence before contact. The welcome home was not a parade. It was something considerably more complicated, a cultural atmosphere of protest and disregard and the general national impulse, in that particular moment, to look away from Vietnam veterans as quickly as possible, as if their presence in public spaces was an inconvenient reminder of a war the country was rapidly becoming ashamed of having started. Adame registered all of this and filed it in the same place he had filed everything else the world had handed him that was unjust and unreasonable, somewhere deep and organized, cataloged but not dwelled upon, because dwelling was a luxury that his mother's ironing board had taught him he could not afford. He enrolled in night school, worked days, studied nights, passed his exams with the same methodical deliberateness that characterized everything he did, earned his civil engineering degree, and spent 35 years after that designing and supervising the construction of the infrastructure of a state that had, within his own living memory, considered him legally less than a full citizen. The bridges, the drainage systems, the municipal water projects, the road expansions. He built this place with his mind and his credentials and the thousands of hours of unremarkable professional labor that constitute a career. The meetings, the blueprints, the site visits, the arguments with contractors, the satisfaction of watching something you design stand up and function in the real world. He did all of this without irony, or rather with the kind of deep, settled irony that has traveled so far past bitterness that it becomes something closer to sovereign pride. He had built Louisiana. Louisiana would not be able to say it didn't know his name. It would not be able to say he hadn't contributed. That had always mattered to him, not for external validation, but as a private, irrefutable accounting, a ledger that could not be argued with. He married Clara Robinson in 1971 at a Baptist church on Government Street, in a ceremony that his mother attended in the hat she reserved for the most significant occasions. Clara taught fourth grade for 31 years at an elementary school in North Baton Rouge, shaping the foundational literacy and mathematical reasoning of hundreds of children who grew up to be nurses and plumbers and teachers themselves, and at least 2 attorneys that anyone kept track of. She was, by the consensus of everyone who knew them as a couple, the sharper half of the pair, quicker to laughter, quicker to anger, more likely to say the precise and irreversible thing that a situation required. James acknowledged this openly and frequently, and with genuine admiration, which Clara said was one of the things she had loved about him from the beginning. He was never threatened by her clarity. They raised 3 children, Diane, Marcus, and Corey, all of whom graduated college, the first generation in either family to do so unanimously, which Clara considered her greatest professional achievement and said so at every opportunity. He lost her on a Tuesday morning in March, 11 years before this story takes place, in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and the particular silence of a place where people are at the very edge of things. He held her hand until the monitors went flat and the nurses withdrew to give him the room to say goodbye in private. The house had felt different ever since. Larger in the wrong ways, full of the specific and irreplaceable absence of a person who had occupied every room in it with her particular kind of aliveness. He kept driving himself everywhere, to the grocery store, to his doctor's appointments on the first Tuesday of each month, to the barbershop on Claiborne Avenue, where he had been going since 1974 and where the conversation had not materially changed in 50 years and where he liked it that way. He kept playing chess on Thursday nights in Raymond Thibodeau's garage, gathered around a folding table with the same group of men he had known for the better part of 3 decades, drinking decaf coffee out of paper cups and arguing about moves with an intensity completely disproportionate to any stakes that were actually present. He was, by the account of every man in that group, formidably good at chess, patient in the way only genuinely patient people are patient, willing to absorb pressure across many moves because he understood that the shape of the game at the end was more important than the shape of the game right now. This was also, as it turned out, a reasonable description of how he approached most things. He still wore the cap, his U.S. Army veteran cap, olive green, faded at the brim from years of sun and handling, shaped by long use to the exact contour of his head, as comfortable on him as skin. He wore it to the grocery store and to the barber shop and to chess on Thursday nights and to church on Sunday mornings and to the gas station on the night of October 3rd, 2023. He did not wear it as a prop. He did not wear it in the hope that someone would notice and offer him the veteran's discount at the diner or the thank you for your service at the checkout line, though both happened regularly, and he accepted them with courteous brevity. He wore it as a statement, a quiet, daily, irrefutable declaration of what he had given to this country and what this country therefore owed him. What any country owes the people who have put their bodies between it and its enemies, even when the country forgot, especially when it forgot. The cap said, I was here. I served. I built things. I bury my wife. I raised children who raised children. I'm still here, and I am not finished. Tonight, all he needed was gas. He had let the needle drop below a quarter tank on the drive to Raymond's and had decided to stop on the way home rather than face an empty gauge in the morning, the way Clara had always scolded him for doing. James, you will be stranded somewhere, is what she always said, and she was always right about everything, and the fact that she was no longer available to be right about things was a loss he had simply learned to carry without putting it down. He pulled into the Phillips 66 at 9:14 p.m., swiped his card at the pump, and stood beside the Mercedes in the cool October air, waiting for the tank to fill. He was probably thinking about the chess game, about the end game he'd mishandled and the move he should have played instead. He was not thinking about what was coming. There was no reason to be. At 9:17 p.m., someone picked up a phone and dialed 911. The caller was anonymous. The number traced later to a prepaid device that was never recovered, and the voice on the recording belonging to no individual the department ever publicly identified. The report, preserved in the case record that would eventually become central evidence in a federal civil rights trial, described a black man sitting in a Mercedes in the parking lot of the Phillips 66 on Mansfield Road, described by the caller as acting suspicious. No crime was named in the call. No weapon was mentioned. No disturbance. No altercation. No victim. No specific threat. No description of any behavior that could be meaningfully categorized as suspicious beyond the bare, unadorned fact of a black man in an expensive car at a gas station at 9 o'clock on a weekday night. Just a man. Just a car. Just someone, somewhere in the vicinity, who had decided that the combination represented a problem requiring a professional response, and who had reached for their phone and converted that private discomfort into a police dispatch. The call was logged at 9:17. A unit was assigned at 9:19. The full institutional machinery of American law enforcement began its rotation, not because anything illegal was occurring in that parking lot, not because any citizen was in danger or any law was being violated, but because someone had made a call, and the call had entered the system, and the system, once set in motion, moved with the impartial momentum of something that does not stop to ask whether it should have started. Kenneth Crockett was 31 years old, for years on the Shreveport force, the kind of officer whose file told a story that his supervisors had chosen not to read carefully. 3 prior complaints for excessive force, each one filed by a black resident of the city, each one moving through the internal affairs process and emerging on the other side dismissed, insufficient evidence, or unfounded, or the particular bureaucratic category that means we reviewed it and decided it was fine. Crockett had felt the review process and walked away from it each time with his badge intact and his certainty undisturbed, which is perhaps the most dangerous outcome an accountability process can produce. Not punishment, not even meaningful consequence, but the lesson that the institution will absorb what you do and protect you from what follows. Arthur Farrell was 28, 2 years on the force, his record technically cleaner. No formal complaints, no documented incidents, but his instincts shaped by the same culture, the same training, the same unspoken institutional curriculum about which bodies and which situations constitute a threat that must be managed and which do not. They were, in this sense, not unusual officers. They were, in this sense, exactly what the system had produced, and the system had no particular reason, before the night of October 3rd, to believe that production was a problem. They pulled into the gas station at 9:21 p.m. with their hands already moving toward their holsters before they had finished parking. That detail, captured on the dash cam, noted by Osimensa in her opening statement, replayed for the jury, matters. The holsters moved before they had seen anything, before they had assessed anything. The posture of threat preceded the encounter, which means it was not a response to anything James Adame did. It was a response to the call, to the description, to the category. The Mercedes was a 2019 S-Class, black, immaculate, not a scratch on it. James Adame had purchased it 3 years earlier with money he had earned and saved across a career of 35 years, and he had paid for it the same way he had paid for everything across his 78 years on this earth. In full, without shortcuts, without debt he hadn't planned for, without asking for a single thing he hadn't earned with his own mind and his own labor. That fact would be placed before the jury with precision by Attorney Osemensa at trial, because it mattered to the portrait. This was not a man who had stumbled into an expensive car. This was a man to whom the car was simply the appropriate vehicle for someone who had worked at his level for as long as he had worked. In a different world, that car would have been a signal of exactly what it was: professional success, earned comfort, a life well built. In the parking lot of the Phillips 66 at 9:21 p.m. on October 3rd, it was apparently a reason to call 911. It didn't matter that night. Not in that parking lot, not under that fluorescent canopy. It would matter later, in a way that Crockett and Farrell could not have imagined, and the city of Shreveport would spend $19 million wishing it could undo. The patrol car rolled in slow, the way patrol cars do when they want to be seen arriving, and the lights came on. James Adame, standing at the pump, watched it come. He did not move. He did not reach for anything. He did not change his posture or his expression in any way that the dashcam would later be able to record as threatening or anxious or unusual. He stood still, and he watched the car come, and he recognized the moment for exactly what it was, because he had been recognizing this moment in various forms for most of his adult life. Not this exact parking lot, not these exact officers, but this exact moment, the arrival of official attention without cause, the repositioning of presumption, the shift in who must prove what to whom. He had navigated this moment in different configurations across decades. Every black man in America of a certain age has a version of this moment stored somewhere in his body. It doesn't get easier with repetition. It gets more familiar, which is a different thing entirely, and in some ways considerably worse. Crockett approached from the driver's side, coming to stand just inside the boundary of comfortable conversational distance, just close enough to be a statement. Farrell swung wide to Adame's right, moving into his periphery, positioning himself behind the clean geometry of Adame's sight line. A positioning that is taught, that is deliberate, that places one officer where the subject cannot easily watch them and the other officer simultaneously. Adame understood the geometry. He had understood at the moment they got out of the car. The questions came without preamble or greeting or the routine courtesy that most traffic stops nominally include. Where are you going? Whose car is this? Where are you coming from? Each question delivered with the particular flatness of someone who has already decided that the answers are going to be inadequate. Adame answered each one in the same voice he had used all evening, the same voice he had used at the chess table, at the dinner table, in the engineering meetings where he was often the only black man in the room and had learned, decades ago, that being the calmest person present was a form of authority that no one could take from you. Home. Mine. Chess. One word each. No elaboration. No apology. No performance of innocence, because James Adame had learned a long time ago that performing innocence in situations like this one was both undignified and ineffective. The guilty perform. The innocent simply are, and he was simply himself, a 78-year-old man who had stopped for gas on his way home from chess and was now standing in a gas station parking lot answering questions he had done nothing to deserve. The tone did not soften. It sharpened, an incremental increase in authority, in pressure, in the implicit message that Adame's calm answers were somehow insufficient, that the situation required more from him than he was offering. The instruction came. Step out of the vehicle. Adame had not been in the vehicle. He had been standing at the pump. The instruction was technically inaccurate, which was beside the point. The point was the instruction itself, the assertion of control over the space and over his body, and Adame understood this and complied. He moved slowly and with great deliberateness, The way a 78-year-old man whose knees have been surgically rebuilt twice moves when he is also simultaneously making certain that every motion is visible, narrated, free from ambiguity. He straightened to his full height. The U.S. Army veteran cap sat squarely on his head, positioned exactly as he always wore it, clearly and unmistakably visible under the full fluorescent wash of the gas station canopy. Crockett looked at it. Farrell, from behind, could see it. Neither one acknowledged it. Not a pause. Not a question. Not a flicker of recalibration. The cap, which in any other context would have been a conversation starter, which strangers in grocery store checkout lines regularly used as an occasion to say thank you for your service, registered in that parking lot as nothing at all. It was as if it were not there. He reached toward his back pocket for his wallet, and the atmosphere around the three of them changed immediately. Crockett's hand dropping toward his holster, Farrell going very still in Adame's periphery. Adame did not startle, did not speed up, did not change his pace by a single fraction. He narrated the motion aloud as he completed it, the way black men learn to narrate their own bodies in situations where silence around a movement can be fatal. I'm reaching for my wallet. I'm going to get my ID. He produced the military ID and held it out steady, between two fingers, arm extended, at a height and angle that made it legible from where Crockett was standing. His arm did not waver. His hand did not shake. He held it with the steadiness of a man who has decided absolutely and in advance how this moment is going to go, who has decided that he will be the calmest, most composed, most unimpeachable presence in this parking lot if it takes every ounce of discipline he has accumulated across 78 years to maintain that. This was the moment that everything should have stopped. Every protocol, every professional instinct, every shred of basic human recognition that said, this man is elderly, he has a military ID, he is wearing a veteran's cap, he has answered your questions calmly and completely. There is no crime here. There has never been any crime here. It should have stopped. The encounter should have ended here, with something approaching an apology, with the acknowledgement that a mistake had been made, that an anonymous tip had sent two officers to interrupt an old man's evening for no reason, and that the right thing, the professional thing, the human thing, was to say so and let him finish pumping his gas. It didn't stop. It didn't even pause. Adame held the ID out in the fluorescent light and looked Kenneth Crockett directly in the eye. When he spoke, there was nothing in his voice that asked for anything. No plea, no desperation, no upward tilt that might be interpreted as uncertainty. His voice carried the full, settled, unhurried weight of a man who has already survived things that these two officers, 31 and 28, a combined 59 years of life between them, could not have imagined on their most difficult days. The jungle, the heat, the silence before contact, the grief of a Tuesday morning in March. The 40 years of being the only person who looked like him in rooms where decisions were made. He had survived all of it and built something beautiful on the other side of it. And the voice that spoke in that parking lot carried all of that history the way a river carries everything upstream of it. I serve for this country, he said. You'll regret this. And Kenneth Crockett laughed. Not the laugh of a man who is nervous, who doesn't know quite what to do with a situation that has gone in an unexpected direction. Not the laugh of someone who has been caught off guard by information that changes the picture. A short, flat, contemptuous exhale, 2 seconds of sound that carried, with perfect clarity, a single unambiguous message. I don't believe you. I don't respect you. I don't need to. The laugh was the distillation of everything that had gone wrong in that parking lot from the moment the patrol car pulled in. The presumption, the dismissal, the fundamental failure to see James Adame as someone whose word, whose ID, whose cap, whose 78 years of accumulated dignity could mean anything that mattered. 2 seconds of audio, preserved in perfect fidelity on the dash cam, that the Shreveport Police Department would spend 14 months trying to keep anyone from seeing. Those 2 seconds would be replayed in a federal courtroom. They would be replayed 61 million times on the internet, in living rooms and on phone screens on every continent, in veterans' homes and military barracks, and the dining rooms of families who had served and come home to a country that still sometimes did this, still sometimes laughed. They would be the 2 seconds that ended Kenneth Crockett's career, the 2 seconds that cost the city of Shreveport $19 million, the 2 seconds that placed an entire police department under federal oversight and permanently altered the trajectory of American law enforcement accountability conversation. But in that parking lot, in that moment, there was just a sound that hung in the October air before Farrell moved in from behind. The handcuffs clicked into place with the flat, mechanical finality of something that has been done thousands of times and means nothing to the person doing it, which made it worse somehow. The casualness of it, the routine quality of it, the way Crockett and Farrell moved through the next minutes with the efficiency of men completing a familiar procedure. Adame did not resist. He did not pull away, did not raise his voice, did not give them a single gesture or word or expression that could be recorded, written down, used. Because he had lived long enough, had navigated enough of these moments across enough decades to understand exactly what was being recorded and exactly what it could be used for, and he refused, categorically, with every ounce of the discipline his mother had ironed into him on Sunday mornings for 20 years, to give them anything. The walk to the patrol car was short. They put him in the back seat. James Adame, Bronze Star recipient, builder of infrastructure, husband of Clara, father of Diane and Marcus and Corey, grandfather of 8, a man who had pulled wounded soldiers from enemy fire on the other side of the world and brought them back to the line when he could have kept moving. They put him in the back seat and they closed the door. Outside, the dash cam continued its recording. Inside, James Adame sat in the dark of the back seat and he waited. He had been waiting, in one form or another, for one thing or another, his entire life. He knew how it was done. He knew the quality of patience that is not passive, that is not resignation, that is something much more deliberate and much more dangerous to the people who mistake it for weakness. His patience in that backseat was the most powerful thing in that parking lot. It was more powerful than the badges and the handcuffs and the anonymous 911 call and the institutional machinery that had put him there. It was the patience of a man who understood, with complete and unshakable certainty, that time was on his side, that it had always been on his side, that it always would be. They opened the back door of the patrol car at 10:09 p.m. and told James Adame he was free to go. Crockett delivered the information with the flat efficiency of a drive-through window. No apology, no explanation, no incident report because no incident report had been filed, a detail that would matter enormously in the months ahead, a detail that Denise Adame would highlight in every FOIA request, and that Renata Osimensa would place before the jury with the careful precision of someone laying a foundation stone. Nothing that acknowledged that a 78-year-old decorated veteran had just spent 47 minutes handcuffed in the back of a police vehicle for the act of stopping to pump gas on a weekday night. Farrell was already walking back toward the cruiser. The gas pump where Adame had been standing was still waiting. Patient as he was, the transaction paused and suspended in exactly the state it had been in when the lights came on. His Mercedes was exactly where he'd left it. His jacket was folded on the passenger seat with his phone tucked in the inside pocket, and that phone had been ringing his daughter Diane, his son Marcus, Raymond from the chess group, 2 other numbers he recognized from Thursday nights, for the better part of an hour while he sat in the back of the patrol car unable to reach it. His chess friends had started calling each other sometime around the 40-minute mark. A quiet and then less quiet alarm spreading through the group the way alarm spreads, through people who have known each other long enough to understand when something is wrong. Old men who play chess together on Thursday nights know each other's habits with the intimacy of long association. They know who is always early and who always runs 5 minutes late. They know whose knees have been giving them trouble and who has a doctor's appointment coming up. And they know, with the particular sensitivity of people who have reached the age where their friends begin to disappear, when someone's absence has the wrong texture to it. Adame was always punctual. His phone always answered. The wrong texture had set in well before 10 o'clock, and the calls were going to voicemail, and the alarm had moved from quiet to something considerably less so by the time he retrieved his phone from his jacket pocket, saw the accumulated missed calls, and stood for a moment in the parking lot of the Phillips 66 on Mansfield Road processing the full inventory of what had just happened to him. He finished pumping his gas. He did this first, before he called anyone, because the alternative was to leave the task undone, and that was not how he operated. Then he drove himself home. He did not turn on the radio. He did not make calls from the car. He drove in silence through the October streets of Shreveport, past the neighborhoods he had watched change across the decades, past the infrastructure whose construction he had overseen in some cases, and he let the silence do what silence does for people who know how to use it. He let it arrange things. He let it sort the evening into its proper shape. When he got inside his house, he sat down at the kitchen table under the overhead light that Clara had chosen at a hardware store in 1993 and that he had never changed because there was no reason to change it. And he called his daughter. He told her what had happened with the same voice he had used all evening, the measured, precise, untheatrical voice that was simply how he communicated when he wanted to be clearly understood. He was calm. She was not. When he finished, she was crying, and he waited for her to finish. And then he told her not to worry, that he was home, and he was fine, and that he was going to handle it correctly. He didn't sleep that night. The thoughts that came in the dark were not frightened thoughts. Fear had not been the primary texture of the evening for him, because fear requires uncertainty, and he had understood exactly what was happening from the moment the patrol car lights came on. The thoughts were more methodical than that, more like an engineering problem being rotated slowly in the mind, examined from each angle, measured. Before 8 o'clock the next morning, he called a lawyer. His granddaughter Denise was 29 years old and had been working as a paralegal at a civil litigation firm in Houston for 4 years, which meant she had spent 4 years learning, in considerable detail, how institutions protect themselves and how they can be made to stop. She was meticulous by temperament, the kind of person who reads the entire user agreement before clicking accept, who keeps digital copies of everything, who has a filing system that other people in her office describe with a combination of admiration and mild alarm. She was also, when the situation called for it, relentless in a way that had very little relationship to emotion and a great deal of relationship to patience and the strategic management of available tools. When her grandfather called and told her what had happened, she listened to the complete account without interrupting, asked 3 specific clarifying questions, and said, "I'll file the FOIA request this week." Within 14 days of the October 3rd incident, she had submitted the first formal public records request to the Shreveport Police Department, citing Louisiana's public records law by statute number, requesting any and all dashcam, bodycam, and dispatch audio recordings related to the contact with James Adame on Mansfield Road on the evening of October 3rd, 2023. The response arrived in under 10 days, footage not located. She filed again, this time more specifically worded, with additional statutory citations and a narrow date-and-time window that made the footage impossible to plausibly not locate. Pending internal review. A third request, submitted through the law firm, where she worked with the firm's letterhead and the names of 2 licensed attorneys appended, citing the specific obligations and timelines mandated by Louisiana public records law, and noting that failure to comply within the statutory window would itself constitute a violation subject to legal remedy. Denied on procedural grounds. A response so vague as to be nearly content-free. A piece of paper that said nothing while technically constituting a reply. A fourth request, this one submitted jointly with an ACLU staff attorney who had reviewed the case and found it straightforwardly compelling, with a cover letter that was less a request than a formal notification of impending legal action. Denied without explanation. No reason given. No timeline offered. No acknowledgement that the footage existed or had ever existed or that the department had any obligation to the question at all. What the Shreveport Police Department had not adequately calculated was Denise Adame. It had not calculated that she had been documenting every denial, every delay, every non-response, and its precise date and the statutory deadline it violated, in a file that was growing month by month into something that looked, from a certain angle, less like a records request and more like a case. She brought that file to the ACLU's Louisiana chapter. They brought it to federal court. A federal judge, reviewing the documentation of 4 denials across 14 months, issued a compelled disclosure order, which is the judiciary's way of saying, you don't have a choice anymore. On December 19th, 2024, 442 days after James Adame sat in the back of a patrol car on Mansfield Road, The Shreveport Police Department produced the dashcam footage in full. The cover-up, meticulously reconstructed from 4 denial letters and 3 sets of court filings and 14 months of documented stonewalling, had by this point become its own case inside the original case, a second indictment running parallel to the first. The department had not merely failed to hold 2 officers accountable for what they did on October 3rd. It had spent over a year in active, documented, provable effort to ensure that no one with the power to hold those officers accountable would ever be able to see what happened. That effort, and the evidence of it, would sit on the plaintiff's table in a federal courtroom and do its own particular damage to the city of Shreveport's position. Denise uploaded the footage on the morning of December 21st, 2024, with a caption she wrote in less than 30 seconds because she had decided, correctly, that it did not need to be complicated. My grandfather served his country. Watch what they did to him. She attached the clip of the laugh. Not the full 47-minute video, not the arrest, not the dismissal, just the 2 seconds, and she pressed post and walked to the kitchen to make coffee. By the time she came back to her phone, the video had 400,000 views. By noon it had crossed 1 million. By the time she turned her phone face down to try to get some sleep that night, the counter had passed 30 million and was still moving. The laugh was the kind of thing that needed no context, no accompanying explanation, no thread of backstory to make its meaning land. You could watch 2 seconds of Kenneth Crockett's laugh without knowing anything about James Adame, without knowing anything about the Cap or the Bronze Star or the 2 tours or the 35-year career or the 4 FOIA denials, and the meaning was still perfectly, devastatingly clear. It said what it said. It meant what it meant. And people from countries that had nothing to do with Shreveport, Louisiana, people whose relationship to American policing was purely observational, who watched from other continents with a mix of horror and recognition that comes from understanding that this particular failure is not uniquely American, even if it is specifically expressed here. Those people shared it too, because the laugh translated perfectly across every language and every context. Veterans organizations shared it with the wordless fury of people who understand exactly what is being dismissed when a man's service is laughed at to his face. Military family groups shared it with the specific grief of having watched someone they loved put on a uniform for a country that would do this. Civil rights organizations shared it as evidence of a pattern that had no shortage of prior documentation and that somehow still managed to produce new examples. The hashtags trended nationally for 6 consecutive days. The Shreveport Police Department's phone lines rang unanswered. Their carefully worded Monday morning statement, assembled, no doubt, by a communications officer and reviewed by legal counsel, and constructed with the specific architecture of something that acknowledges without admitting and expresses without apologizing, satisfied no one and persuaded fewer. Crockett and Farrell were placed on administrative leave. Their personnel files, now public record and widely circulated, showed 3 prior excessive force complaints against Crockett, each one dismissed, each one now being read by 61 million people who are capable of drawing their own conclusions about what a pattern of dismissed complaints means. The internal affairs process had decided, 3 times, that those complaints did not require permanent attachment. The internet attached them permanently. The case was filed in the United States District Court for the Western District of Louisiana as Adame versus City of Shreveport, and in the federal docket, it was a civil rights action under 42 U.S.C. Section 1983 alleging unlawful seizure, excessive force, and deliberate institutional indifference. In the courtroom, it was something considerably more than a case. It was a reckoning with what 2 officers had done on October 3rd, with what a department had done across the 14 months that followed, and with the broader institutional architecture that had made both possible and had, until Denise Adame's filing system and a federal judge's compelled disclosure order kept both invisible. Lead attorney Renata Osemensa had been in federal court for 20 years, had tried dozens of police misconduct cases, had developed a reputation in legal circles for the particular skill of making complex institutional failures legible to 12 people who had not spent their careers thinking about them. She built the case on 4 pillars and laid them out in her opening statement with the unhurried precision of someone who has already done the math and knows where it lands. The dashcam audio with its 2 seconds of laughter, the 14-month documented cover-up, and its 4 denial letters, the 3 prior dismissed complaints against Crockett, and what they revealed about the department's accountability culture, and James Adame himself. The city's defense was competent and well-resourced and ultimately insufficient. Its central argument, that the October 3rd encounter had been routine, professionally managed, and objectively reasonable given the nature of the dispatch call, was coherent in the abstract and catastrophic in contact with the specific facts, because the specific facts included a laugh. Adame took the stand on the 3rd day of trial. He was 79 years old by then, and he wore a pressed charcoal suit and the veteran's cap, and he sat in the witness chair with the same quality of stillness he had brought to the gas station parking lot 16 months earlier. The stillness of a man who has decided in advance how the moment is going to go and has the resources to maintain that decision. He did not perform. He did not reach for sympathy or invite the jury to be outraged on his behalf. He described the evening of October 3rd the way an engineer described a structure, precisely, sequentially, with attention to the details that matter and without embellishment of the details that don't. He described the questions and his answers. He described reaching for his wallet and narrating the motion aloud because he understood what reaching for something meant in that context and what the consequences of ambiguity could be. He described holding out his military ID and looking Kenneth Crockett in the eye. He described the laugh. He described this without drama, with the flat accuracy of a man reporting what occurred, and the courtroom was so completely silent when he finished that the only sound was the court reporter's keys, which seemed very loud in that silence. On cross-examination, the defense attempted to suggest that the encounter had been brief, professional, and non-injurious in any physical sense. Adame agreed with all of this and then said, quietly, that he hadn't described a physical injury. The jury heard the laugh 4 times during deliberations. They sent a note to the judge requesting to replay the audio, and the judge granted it, and they played it 4 times before returning to the room. 97 minutes after they were sent to deliberate, they came back. The verdict was $19 million. The 4-person read it without looking up from the paper, in the flat voice of someone delivering information rather than drama. And James Adame sat at the plaintiff's table with his hands folded on the table in front of him and the cap on his head, and his face wearing the expression of a man who had known from the morning of October 4th when he picked up the phone and called a lawyer before 8 o'clock, that this was always where it was going to end. Not because he was certain of the legal system, but because he was certain of himself. Kenneth Crockett and Arthur Farrell were terminated without pension in the weeks following the verdict, the department finally completing the accountability process it had spent 14 months avoiding. The Shreveport Police Department was placed under a federal consent decree with specific, enforceable provisions. Mandatory dashcam audits conducted quarterly, department-wide implicit bias training developed with input from independent civil rights organizations, and a permanent civilian oversight board with genuine investigative authority and the ability to compel disclosure. A board with, in the language of the decree, real teeth. The decree represented a structural acknowledgement that what had happened on October 3rd was not the isolated failure of 2 individual officers, but the predictable output of an institutional culture that had, across years and 3 prior dismissed complaints and 14 months of active concealment, repeatedly chosen protection over accountability. The structure would change. The oversight would be real. The city of Shreveport would not be able to say about the next James Adame that hadn't been warned. Adame directed a portion of the $19 million settlement toward establishing the Adame Veterans Dignity Fund, a nonprofit legal organization staffed by civil rights attorneys with specific expertise in cases involving elderly veterans facing civil rights violations. The fund would provide representation, free of charge, to veterans across the country who had been treated the way James Adame was treated, who had held out a military ID to someone who laughed at it, or who had worn a veteran's cap that no one acknowledged, or who had served a country that still, sometimes, couldn't be bothered to see them. It was, as several commentators noted at the time, an entirely characteristic response. He took the money the system owed him and used it to make sure the system would owe fewer people in the future. Denise was recruited by the ACLU's national office before the settlement check had cleared, her 14-month documentation project having demonstrated a quality of sustained strategic persistence that the organization had noted with considerable professional interest. She accepted. The Phillips 66 on Mansfield Road installed a small bronze plaque near the entrance sometime in the spring following the verdict. No press release was issued, no announcement made. The installation was quiet, without ceremony, the plaque simply appearing one morning on the brick pillar beside the door. A local journalist noticed it on her way to work, stopped, photographed it, and published 3 sentences of context alongside the image. The photograph found its own corner of the internet, smaller than the original 61 million views, quieter, a different register entirely, and stayed there. The plaque said James Adame's name and the date, and the simple declarative fact of what he had done for his country. It did not say what the country did to him in return on that date, because the plaque didn't need to. Everyone who had stopped to read it already knew. At the press conference, James Adame sat in the front row in a crisp white button-down shirt, his hands resting on his knees, his posture exactly as it had always been, unhurried, upright, completely unassailable. He was still wearing the cap. A reporter near the back of the room, after the formal statements had concluded and the floor had been opened, asked him what he wanted people to take away from everything that had happened, from the night at the gas station and the 47 minutes in the back of the patrol car and the 14 months of silence and the courtroom and the verdict and all of it, the complete arc of the thing from beginning to this room. Adame was quiet for a long moment, long enough that the cameras adjusted, long enough that the room, which had been producing the low, ambient sound of a room full of people and equipment, went to something approaching stillness. He looked at the reporter, and then he looked at something past the reporter, and then he spoke, simply, without reaching for effect, in the same voice he had used in the parking lot and in the witness chair and on the phone with his daughter at the kitchen table under Clara's light. The voice of a man who says what he means because he has never had the patience for anything else. "I'm still here," he said, "and I always knew I would be."